He dragged the boy through loose gravel, boots slipping as blood soaked into his sleeve, the child's weight sagging hard against his arms while his bad shoulder tore where an old bullet still sat deep and wrong. Breath came thin, sharp. Then he noticed the braided cord tied tight at the boy's arm, placed there for someone who mattered. Hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, closing fast. "That's the chief's son, you don't touch him," a rider warned. The boy stirred, small fingers clutching his coat. Sealer's creed didn't set him down, because carrying him now meant by nightfall, every man in that canyon would be hunting him. Before we ride deeper into this tale, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another journey through the dust, danger, and legends of the Wild West. Now, back to the trail. Sealer's creed shifted the boy higher against his chest and kept moving, boots scraping loose stone as the canyon narrowed around him. The child was lighter than he should have been, all bone and breath and blood. Each step sent a hot grind through Sealer's shoulder, deep where old lead still sat like a curse the doctor had never cut free. He ignored it. Pain was only noise if a man had work left in him. Behind him, the riders spread out instead of rushing. That troubled him more than a charge would have. They knew the ground, knew the choke points, knew there was nowhere to run once the canyon bent south into red rock walls and thorn scrub. One voice carried again, calm now, certain. "Set him down, Cowboy. You carry him farther, you make it worse." Sealer's didn't answer. Breath came hard through his teeth. The boy's head rolled against his arm, dark hair stuck to his temple with sweat. An ugly cut split the skin above one ear, not a fall, too clean, too straight. Someone had struck him, then Sealers saw more. Dust had caked over the boy's shirt, but not enough to hide the careful stitching at the collar. Fine work, hand done, the kind no trail family wasted on ordinary wear. Around the child's wrist, beneath the braided cord, was a thin strip of softened leather stamped with a small pressed mark. Not ranch brand, not army issue, a sign made for recognition, not ownership. Important boy, protected boy, the kind men killed for or started wars over. He rounded a jut of stone and nearly stumbled over the horse. A paint mare lay in the shade with her flank torn open, reins snapped, one stirrup twisted under her belly. An arrow shaft had splintered near the saddle blanket. Not tribal make, wrong fletching, cheap work. The sight hit him like cold water. Whoever hurt the boy had not come to take him home. The child made a sound then, barely more than air. Sealers dropped to one knee beside the mare, shielding the boy with his body. "You hear me?" The boy's lashes fluttered, his lips moved once. "Nahel." Sealers frowned, name or warning he couldn't tell. The hoofbeats stopped somewhere above. Silence poured down from the rim, not empty silence, watching silence. A pebble clicked off the rock face to his right, then another. He looked up and saw them at last, 3 riders on the ridge. Still as fence posts, faces unreadable at that distance. One held up an open hand, not a gun, a warning or a command. The oldest among them leaned forward in the saddle and called down, "That boy is not for you." Sealers glanced at the mare again. The broken arrow, the blood on the child's temple, the snapped reins, none of it fit clean. If these men meant to save him, why circle instead of ride down? Why wait? The boy's fingers tightened weakly in Sealers' shirt. Below the child's hand, tucked half inside his torn vest, was a folded paper gone dark at the edges with blood. Sealers pulled it free. Thick stock, government seal pressed into one corner. The writing was smeared, but one word stayed clear through the red, agency. His jaw hardened. That changed the shape of things. A chief's son injured near agency business meant soldiers, traders, or thieves had already put a hand where they should not have. A wrong move now would not stay in the canyon. It would spread into town, into tribal land, into every frightened fool eager to blame the nearest enemy. From above, the rider called again, voice flatter this time, "Leave him and walk away breathing." Sealers looked from the paper to the child, then to the dead-eyed mare at his side. A safe man would set the boy down. A smart man would back away. But the boy had been struck, hunted, and left with a lie forming around him already. Sealers shoved the paper inside his coat, rose with the child in his arms, and turned toward the narrow pass leading deeper south. Because if he chose wrong in the next 10 minutes, he would not just lose his life. He might hand this whole frontier the reason it had been waiting for. Silas took 3 steps toward the narrow pass before a rifle cracked above him. The shot hit stone near his boots and sprayed his shins with chips. Not meant to kill, meant to mark a line. He stopped, the boy sagging heavier in his arms. Wind moved low through the canyon's scrub, carrying dust, horse sweat, and the faint, bitter scent of old smoke. The riders on the ridge had not shifted much, but he could feel the change in them. The courtesy was gone. The warning had become a boundary. Far enough, the older rider called down. Silas turned just enough to see him better. Gray worked through the man's braids. His shoulders were broad, but age had leaned him slightly forward in the saddle, not weak, weathered. The kind of man who did not waste words because he had already buried the men who had. "The boy's hurt," Silas said. "We see that." "Then come get him." The rider's face stayed hard. "If we ride down and find your hand on him, there will be blood before sunset. Not because we want it, because others will demand it." Silas shifted the boy carefully. The child made a small sound and pressed his face into Silas's coat. Heat clung to him now, too much, fever rising. "He won't last on this ground," Silas said. The older rider studied him, then the dead mare nearby, then the broken arrow shaft. He had seen the same wrongness Silas had. Men who knew a land could also know when the truth had been bent out of shape. Still, his next words came flat. "Set him down, step away, leave breathing." Silas almost laughed at that, as if breathing was still the measure. The folded agency paper pressed against his ribs inside his coat. He could feel it like a second wound. That seal had changed the thing from a rescue into tinder. A chief's son struck down, agency paper in his vest. A horse felled by somebody using cheap arrows to make the blame fall easy. There were hands in this already that wanted more than one boy dead. Below him, loose stone shifted. He glanced left and saw another rider coming through a cut in the canyon wall, not above but behind. Younger, fast, rifle across the saddle. More would be circling now. The pass ahead would close in another minute, maybe less. "Cowboy," the gray-haired man called. "The next shot won't miss your feet." Silas looked at the boy. Blood had dried at the temple, but fresh red seeped through the cloth of his shirt lower down, near the ribs. Knife work maybe, or a glancing shot. The child's hand clutched once at air, then found Silas's vest again, like he had decided the fabric was all that stood between him and the dark. A safe man would lay him down. A man with sense would walk away. Silas had once done the sensible thing. Years ago, different place, different dust. He had obeyed an order because it was cleaner than his own conscience. By dawn, 2 women and a stable boy were dead in a boarding house fire that should have been stopped the night before. Since then, sense had tasted too much like cowardice. He bent and set the child behind a chest-high slab of stone, not down to leave him, down to work. The younger rider in the cut shouted, "He's reaching." Silas ignored him, tore a strip from the inside hem of his shirt with one hard pull, and pressed it against the wound near the boy's ribs. The child flinched, eyes flying half open. Dark eyes, frightened but fighting. "Stay with me," Silas muttered. The gray-haired rider watched in silence now. Silas wrapped the cloth tight and tied it off with one hand and his teeth. His shoulder screamed. He let it. Then he pulled his canteen, tipped a few drops onto the boy's lips, and waited until he swallowed. "What's your name?" Silas asked. The boy's voice barely rose. "Tawa." That name settled the air. Even the riders on the ridge changed at it. Not much, enough. The older man breathed out slowly. "You should not know that name." "But I do." The younger rider behind called. "He lies." "No," Silas said, eyes still on the child. "He bleeds." He took the boy back into his arms and stood. 3 rifles shifted toward him. The gray-haired rider leaned down over his saddle horn. "If you carry Tawa into our land, every eye will see insult before mercy. Men already hunger for a reason. Your town fears us. Some of ours hate you. There are mothers on both sides who have buried enough. Put him down." Silas met his gaze. "And if I do?" The rider said nothing for a beat. "Then maybe you walk away." "Maybe," Silas repeated. The man did not look away. That is the best truth I can offer. The best truth, that more than the rifles made the choice plain, no promise, no justice. No certainty the boy would even be lifted before the buzzards learned the scent. Just a chance for Silas to save his own skin and let the rest sort itself by people who had already come too slow. He looked again at the broken arrow by the mare, wrong fletching, wrong maker. Whoever had struck here wanted rage to land easy. If Tawa died in the dust with a cowboy standing over him, no one would need facts after that. The younger rider cursed and raised his rifle higher. Enough. Silas did not draw, did not lunge. He only turned his body so it covered the child more fully. He lives if I keep moving, Silas said. That's the only part I trust. The gray-haired rider closed his eyes for a moment, as if some old grief had walked back into his chest. When he opened them, he looked older. What is your name? Silas Creed. The man nodded once, like he would remember it whether he wanted to or not. Mine is Nodin. Hear me well, Silas Creed. If you cross that pass with him, you choose against your own people, your own law, and your own safety. Men in town will call you traitor. Men among us may call you thief. The land between will not protect you. Silas adjusted Tawa's weight. The boy didn't ask for any of that. No. He asked for water. Nodin's jaw tightened. Behind him, the younger rider snapped, let him try. Silas moved then, not running, a measured stride into the throat of the pass, where red stone narrowed and the sky became a seam. A second shot cracked. This time it struck the rock wall by his head. Dust burst across his hat brim. But no bullet followed. He kept walking. Wind rushed through the gap with a low, hollow sound, like the land itself had drawn breath and held it. Behind him came hoofbeats, but not a full chase. Escorts, shadows keeping pace where the walls rose too high to see them. He could hear them switching sides above, then disappearing, then returning farther on, herding him, testing him, letting danger walk under watch. Tawa drifted in and out. Once he stirred enough to whisper something Silas did not catch. Once he jerked from a dream and clutched Silas's coat so hard the fabric creaked. Each time Silas spoke low, not because he had anything wise to say, but because silence can sound too much like leaving. The pass opened after half a mile into country rougher than the ranch cuts north of town. Cedar clung to shelves of stone. Dry creek slashed through hardpan. Ravens lifted off a carcass somewhere out of sight. The tracks here were old and many, not all horse. Moccasins, drag marks from travois, a place lived in without being surrendered to. Silas found a patch of shade under bent juniper and lowered Tawa again long enough to check the bandage. The wound had seeped through, not pouring, still bad. He opened the canteen, empty except for one swallow. He gave it to the boy. Tawa drank and blinked up at him. He could not have been more than 9. You stole me, the boy asked. Silas almost smiled despite himself. Carried. Tawa thought about that. Nodin will say the same. Don't know yet. The child's gaze drifted toward the ridgeline, where no rider stood visible, though Silas' new eyes were on them. He is my uncle. That fit, the authority, the restraint, the pain. You know who hurt you? Silas asked. Tawa's mouth tightened. For a second the boy looked older than any child should. Men with trade coats. One spoke our tongue badly, one wore a blue badge. His hand twitched weakly towards Silas's chest. Paper. Silas felt the agency document again under his coat. A blue badge, agency man, or someone wearing one he had no right to. Neither answer settled easy. Hoofbeats came at last from below rather than above. 2 riders emerged from a wash, both armed, both silent. Neither pointed a rifle. One dismounted and tossed a skin of water onto the ground between them, then backed away. No gift, no peace, just necessity refusing to call itself kindness. Silas took the skin, nodded once, and poured slowly for the boy. Tawa drank, coughed, then pushed at Silas's wrist. Not much, he whispered, for later. Silas corked it. The rider who had thrown the skin was younger than Nodin, but older than the hothead from before. A white scar ran from his lip into his beard line. He looked at Tawa first, then at Silas. Nodin says you keep to the South Wash. No fire, no wandering, no touching your gun unless you mean to die before using it. Sealers said, where does the wash laid? The man's eyes stayed narrow, to judgment. Then he mounted and rode off. Sealers waited until the sound faded. He checked the boy's bandage again, then rose. He took the South Wash. The land changed as the light lowered. Walls of ochre and rust gave way to stretches of open hard ground with clusters of mesquite. Long shadows pooled in the gullies. Somewhere distant, a drumbeat moved once across the air and stopped, signaling. News carried faster than horses here. Sealers' shoulder had gone beyond pain into numb heat. His right hand tingled off and on. Not good. He shifted Tawa awkwardly to ease it, but the relief never lasted. The paper in his coat rubbed against his ribs each step, a reminder that whatever waited ahead would not end at a campfire and gratitude. Near sundown, he saw the first real sign of village life. Not tents. Not some foolish picture town men liked to trade in saloons when they wanted to sound informed. These were scattered dwellings worked into the land's own shape, smoke venting low, horses tied in shade, women moving with baskets, children pulled back the instant they noticed him. No panic, worse than that. Discipline. He did not make it 3 more paces before 6 men stepped into view. They had been there already. The kind of presence the land taught and the untrained eye missed until it was too late. One spoke, "Stop." Sealers stopped. Another came forward and took Tawa from his arms in one swift motion, fast enough to show skill, gentle enough to show the child mattered more than the threat. Tawa made no cry. Just reached once towards Sealers' coat, maybe for balance, maybe in fear, before the man carried him away. The emptiness in Sealers' arms hit harder than expected. Hands took his revolver, his knife, the spare rounds from his belt. Another man opened his coat, found the paper and froze. That moved through them like sparks through dry brush. The man held it up to the fading light, then looked at Sealers with a new kind of severity. Not because he was more hated now, because he was more dangerous. He was marched through the village while silence gathered. Women paused in their work. An old man at a fire watched without expression. A dog lifted its head and laid it back down. Above them all, red evening settled over the ridges like banked coals. They brought him to a wide shade structure open on 3 sides. Nodin stood there already, so did another man. He sat rather than stood, wrapped in a dark blanket despite the lingering heat. His hair was streaked with iron gray. One eye was clouded, the other missed nothing. A carved staff rested across his knees, not ornamental but worn smooth by use. When the man with the paper placed it in his hands, the whole space seemed to tighten around the act. This then was the one whose son had bled in the canyon. Chief Takoda opened the paper carefully. He looked over the agency seal, the blurred writing, the blood-stained crease. Then he lifted his gaze to Sealers. The clouded eye gave nothing. The clear one gave less. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that the men around him leaned in to hear. You crossed into my land carrying my son and a paper men kill over. He placed the document on his knee. Now tell me, he said, which burden you meant to deliver first. Takoda did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The question settled across the shade structure heavier than a threat. Sealers stood with dust dried white at his boots, his right shoulder gone half dead from strain, his revolver gone from his belt, and every eye in that place waiting to decide whether he had come as fool, thief, or liar. He looked first toward the doorway where Tawa had disappeared. The boy, he said. A murmur moved around the posts. Not approval, not yet. Just surprised that he had answered so plainly. Takoda's clear eye stayed fixed on him. A man carrying one burden often hides another. Sealers took a breath that caught deep in the old bullet wound and let the pain steady him. Then search me again. One of the men behind him stepped forward at once, hand already reaching for his coat. Takoda lifted 2 fingers. The man stopped. Nodin stood to the side, silent as weather, watching both of them. Takoda touched the paper on his knee. You found this where? In the boy's vest. Before or after he spoke his name? After. Takoda let that sit. His thumb moved once along the edge of the folded sheet, not nervous, not idle, measuring. What did he say besides his name? Not much. Takoda waited. Sealers held his gaze. He said men with trade coats hurt him, said one wore a blue badge. That drew the first true shift in the men around him. One looked at Nodin. Another went still in the way armed men do when anger stops moving and turns useful. Takoda's face changed, almost not at all. Only the tendons in his hand tightened around the staff. And you know what a blue badge means in this country. Enough to know it poisons whatever it touches. No one smiled, but Nodin's eyes narrowed with something close to interest. Takoda unfolded the paper now. The blood had smeared much of the writing, but not all. He read it once, then again, then passed it to Nodin, who read slower, his jaw setting harder with each line. Sealers could not make out the words from where he stood, only the agency seal and a few dark strokes of script beneath it. Takoda asked, "If you knew this paper mattered, why carry it here?" "Because leaving it behind would have been easier for the wrong man to find. And bringing it here is easier for the wrong man to blame." "That too." Takoda tipped his head slightly, the first sign that he had expected fear or pleading and found neither. A woman entered the structure then, moving quick but unhurried, a basin in her hands. She did not look at Sealers. She crossed to Takoda, bent and spoke low in a language he did not know. Takoda answered in the same tongue. Her voice sharpened once. He replied without changing expression. She left. Takoda turned back. "My son breathes." Sealers felt his chest loosen by one small measure. "For now," Takoda added. The measure tightened again. One of the younger warriors stepped forward. It was the same man from the canyon cut, the hot-blooded one with anger riding close to the skin. His mouth curled with open dislike. "He carried Tawa because he wanted passage," the man said, "or favor. No white man walks this far south by accident." Sealers said nothing. Takoda looked at the young warrior. "Say your whole thought, Halen." "Halen did. Kill him now, and no one twists this story later." The words fell flat and brutal, offered without drama, a practical killing. The kind frontier land was full of. Takoda's clouded eye did not move, but the clear one sharpened. And if the story is already twisted? Halen's nostrils flared. Then he is part of it. Sealers finally spoke. "Maybe, but not the part that put that wound in the boy." Halen took a step toward him. Nodin's hand snapped out and caught the younger man by the forearm before anyone else moved. The grip was so sudden and so final that Halen stopped, as if he had hit a wall. Takoda said, "A man who cannot stand still when truth is being weighed does not belong near the scale." Halen pulled free and stepped back, face hot with contained shame. Sealers stayed where he was. He had learned long ago that in some rooms the only power left to a man was whether he reached for more. Takoda rose. He was taller than Sealers had guessed from the seated posture, though age and injury had bowed one shoulder slightly. The blanket slipped enough for Sealers to see a thick scar climbing from collarbone to throat, old and white as bleached antler, not a wound hidden. A wound carried openly because its meaning had long outgrown the pain. He crossed the space until only a few feet lay between them. "You brought my son into this place alive," Takoda said. "That has weight, but a coyote can drag a lamb out of fire and still mean to eat it afterward. So I ask again, why did you keep moving when my riders gave you a way to live?" Sealers looked past Takoda for a moment, toward the edge of the village where evening smoke drifted blue and thin. A child was crying somewhere. A horse stamped. The ordinary sounds of a people enduring another day. He knew that sound from ranch yards, army camps, towns after storms, life sounding small because danger had not left, only crouched farther off. "I've walked away before," he said. Takoda waited. "It kept me alive, didn't keep others that way." That was all he gave. No names, no fire, no story shaped to win mercy, just the raw peace. Takoda studied him a long while. Nodin unfolded the paper again. "He should hear this," he said. Takoda nodded. Nodin read aloud in slow English, the words clipped and formal from whoever had written them. A transfer order, a request for discreet movement, mention of the chief's household, mention of leverage, mention of pressure to secure a signature before federal review reached the territory. Enough legal phrasing wrapped around rotten intent to make the whole thing smell worse with every line. Sealers listened without moving. They had planned to use the boy, not kill him perhaps, not at first, but take him, move him quiet, press his father where the law could wear a polished face over a dirty hand. When Nodden finished, silence swelled so deep that the crackle of the nearby cookfire sounded loud. Takoda took the paper back. Men from the agency want land south of the Wash. Men from town want freight routes through it. Men with badges and men with ledgers have been learning each other's language. He folded the paper carefully. My son vanished this morning. Sealers said, then whoever struck him lost hold of him before they reached the handoff. Takoda watched him a beat, then nodded once. That is what I think. Halen spat into the dust. Then the cowboy is useful only until he tells his people what he's seen. Takoda turned. Are they his people? Halen did not answer. Takoda looked back at Sealers. Are they? It was not a trap, asked like one. That made it worse. Sealers thought of town faces, of men he bought nails from twice a year, of a sheriff who liked peace only when it cost nothing, of merchants who grumbled about raids they had never seen while cheating tribe families on flour weights after sundown, of the church bell on Sundays, of the saloon piano on Fridays, of all the small worn things that counted as belonging until belonging demanded a price. I live among them, he said at last. That's not the same answer. Again that almost change at Takoda's mouth, not trust, recognition of a line spoken straight. The woman from earlier returned, this time looking directly at Sealers. There was no softness in her expression, but there was judgment of a different kind. She carried a bloodied cloth, Tawa's cloth. He wakes, she said to Takoda. Takoda's hand closed once around the staff, the first crack in his stillness. He turned to the woman. Does he speak? A little. Then bring him only if he asks. She nodded and left. Takoda remained facing the doorway after she had gone. When he spoke, it was not to Sealers at first. My son likes to climb where rock breaks under him. He has his mother's stubbornness and none of her patience. The words were so simple they almost passed for nothing, but a father had entered the room beneath the chief. He does not trust easily. Then Takoda faced Sealers again. If he asked for you, it matters. Halen said sharply, it should not. Takoda's gaze cut toward him. It does. Sealers stood in the middle of that shifting balance and understood something he had not in the canyon. This was not one test, it was many layered together. Truth, restraint, fear, whether he would try to use their need, whether he would bow too quickly or stand too stiffly, whether he would speak to the father or the chief and mistake one for the other. A boy appeared in the doorway then, not Tawa, older, maybe 14. He paused at the threshold, saw Sealers, and straightened his spine as though to seem taller in the presence of danger. He spoke rapidly to Takoda. Nodden translated for Sealers without being asked. Scouts saw 3 riders north of the Wash. One is the trader Rusk. Sealers felt the name like grit between the teeth. Elias Rusk, freight contracts, salt pork, ammunition, the kind of man who smiled only when someone weaker had run out of room. And the others? Takoda asked. The boy answered. Deputy Mercer, Nodden said, and a man no one knows. Halen gave a short laugh with no humor in it. Now the cowboy's friends come looking. They are not my friends, Sealers said. Takoda heard the speed in that answer. But they know your trail. Sealers thought back. The canyon, the dead mare. The way the riders above had escorted, not hidden him. No, not from his side, from theirs. The trail to this village had been visible to those meant to see it. The setup widened in his mind. Tawa taken, Tawa lost. Agency paper planted or carried. A cowboy found with the boy. Trader and deputy already moving north of the Wash. That was not salvage. That was preparation. Somebody wanted witnesses arranged before truth could speak for itself. Takoda saw the realization land. Yes. For the first time since entering the village, Silas felt something colder than danger. He had not simply carried a wounded child into hostile land. He had been pushed here bearing a match. Takoda spoke to the boy in the doorway. The boy left at once. Then Takoda looked to Nodin. Keep the north trail watched. No one fires first. Halen's head jerked. If Mercer crosses the wash armed. No one fires first, Takoda repeated. The younger man bit back what came next. Takoda turned to Silas. If I let you live the night, men in town may say I hide behind your witness. If I hand you over, they say I fear their law. If I kill you, they get the war they came prepared to explain. Then don't do any of the three, Silas said. Halen laughed outright this time. He gives counsel now. Silas ignored him. You asked what burden I brought first. Maybe it wasn't the boy. Maybe it was proof somebody wants us both cornered stupid. Takoda held his eyes. Silas continued. Rusk doesn't ride with a deputy unless Prophet is about to wear a badge. If he reaches town first with his own story, he'll have men ready to swear I stole your son, or you took me, or both. He'll build whatever truth pays best. Nodin looked at Takoda. He's right. Halen muttered, being right is not the same as being clean. Takoda said, no, but it is not nothing. Footsteps sounded outside. The woman returned again, and this time Tawa was with her. The child moved slowly, one side guarded, blanket around his shoulders, but he walked on his own feet. When he saw Silas, he stopped. The whole structure seemed to stop with him. Takoda's face did not soften, yet something in it listened. Tawa's gaze went to Silas's empty belt, to the men around him, then to the paper in his father's hand. He understood more than children should. That seemed a family condition. Takoda spoke gently now. Tell me what you remember. Tawa swallowed. Men took me near the spring. They had a wagon hidden. One smiled too much. His breathing caught. I bit him. A low sound moved through a few of the older men. Not laughter, approval with grief in it. Tawa kept going. One wore blue, but not right, like new cloth, not old badge cloth. He looked at Silas. This one found me. Takoda asked, did he threaten you? No. Did he ask your name before carrying you? Tawa shook his head. He gave water first. The woman beside him steadied his elbow as the answer passed through the room like a blade laid on a table. Quiet, definitive. Takoda asked one final question. Why did you hold his coat? Tawa frowned as if the answer were obvious. Because he was leaving the bad place. No one spoke after that. Takoda closed his eyes once, briefly, then opened them and sat again. The chief was back where the father had stood. Silas Creed, he said, I do not trust you, not yet, but my son placed his fear in your keeping before I did. That cannot be ignored. He looked to Nodin. He will not be killed. Halen's mouth tightened. Takoda continued. He will be watched, fed, his wound tended. At dawn he will ride with us to the standing shelf. Nodin nodded. Silas said, for what? Takoda folded the paper and tucked it into his blanket, to see whether truth survives daylight. That might have been the end of it, bare life bought for one night, but the story would not hold still. A runner came in hard, breathless, dust to the knees. He spoke fast in their language. Nodin stiffened before Takoda even asked the question. When Nodin answered in English, it was for Silas as much as anyone. Mercer and Rusk are not waiting north of the wash anymore. His eyes went to Takoda. They are riding to town. Silas understood at once. If they could not reach the village before dark, they would do the next best thing. They would get there first, where fear multiplied faster. Takoda understood too. By morning, the town would hear that a chief's son had vanished, a cowboy had gone missing with him, and tribal men were seen armed south of the wash. Men who wanted war never needed a whole lie, just enough truth pointed crooked. Halen smiled without warmth. Now we will see which side claims him. Silas looked toward the dark beyond the structure. He could almost hear the town already, doors shutting, rifles checked, men choosing courage only in groups. Takoda's voice went low and final. "Take him to the outer lodge," 2 men at the door. As the guards stepped toward him, Silas said, "If town moves before dawn, waiting won't help." Takoda did not answer immediately. He watched him the way a man watches a horse on unfamiliar ground, deciding whether steadiness is real or only fatigue. Then he said, "Sleep if you can, Cowboy. Morning will ask more of you than your truth has so far." They led Silas out into the cooling dark. Smoke and cedar hung over the village. Somewhere behind him, Tawa coughed once. Somewhere ahead, the outer lodge waited with 2 guards and no easy morning. And north of the wash, men were already building a story that would be easier to fire than to undo. Silas did not sleep much. The outer lodge was small, round, and spare, built low against the wind. A woven blanket had been thrown near the wall for him, and a bowl of stew set by the door sometime after midnight. He ate because refusing food in a strange place could look like pride, and pride had nearly gotten him killed enough times already. The meat was tough, the broth thin. Better than many trail suppers he had known. Outside, the guards did not speak. Once or twice he heard footsteps pass. Once he heard a horse whinny sharp and be hushed immediately. The village rested without ever seeming unguarded. He sat with his back to the wall and worked his right hand open and shut to keep the numbness from settling permanent in the shoulder. The old bullet had shifted under the day's strain. He knew the feel. Come cold weather, it would remind him worse. If he lived to cold weather, near what he guessed was midnight, the lodge flap lifted. Nodin stepped in alone. Silas did not rise. Nodin seemed the sort to notice unnecessary motion and mark it down as theater. He stood just inside, broad in the low light of the small oil lamp, his face cut into hard planes by flame shadow. "You should be sleeping," Nodin said. "You should be too." Nodin ignored that. He lowered himself carefully onto the opposite side of the lodge, not close enough for friendship, not far enough for distrust alone. He held Silas's revolver in one hand, not offering it, weighing it. "You keep it clean," he said. "It's easier than using it." Nodin glanced up. That is not a white man's usual answer. Silas looked at the gun. "It's not my usual life." For a while Nodin said nothing. Then he laid the revolver across his knees. "When Takoda was younger," he said, "men in blue coats brought him a treaty and a smiling priest. They promised school, grain, fences for cattle, and no more grav from winter hunger. The priest spoke of peace. The men in blue counted the cottonwoods by the river while he spoke. In spring, they said the river itself had changed the map." Silas listened. Takoda learned then that some men steal best while smiling. Since that day, he has trusted pain before promises. He's not alone in that. Nodin's mouth moved at one corner. Maybe agreement, maybe an old bitterness with too many names to pin down. He looked at Silas directly. "Tomorrow, men from town may ride armed to the standing shelf. They will come to demand, not ask. If you speak wrong there, blood starts." Silas said, "Then why let me speak at all?" "Because you are part of the lie they are building. Sometimes the only way to kill a lie is to make it stand in sunlight next to the man it used." Silas considered that. Nodin added, "And because Tawa asked whether you were warm enough." That landed harder than he expected. Nodin saw it and looked away, perhaps out of mercy, perhaps out of respect for silence. He set the revolver beside him on the blanket, but still out of reach. "Do not mistake small kindness for safety," he said. "I won't." "Good." He rose, then paused. From inside his coat, he drew a narrow strip of leather, dark with age, worked with tiny geometric cuts and threaded with one blue bead at the center. Not bright beadwork, not decoration meant to show, something older, hand-worn. Silas looked at it. "What's that?" Nodin turned it once in his fingers. Takoda's father wore this on his rifle sling when soldiers came through winter camp and left with less than they claimed. He cut the sling apart years later when the wood cracked, kept this piece. He slid it back into his coat. He does not keep what means nothing. Sealers frowned. Why tell me that? Nodin lifted the lodge flap. Cold pre-dawn air edged in around him, because if Takoda gives you anything tomorrow, it will not be payment. His eyes settled on Sealers one last time. It will be burden. Then he was gone. The dark thinned slowly after that. Sealers drifted into shallow sleep and out again, never far from the ache in his shoulder or the feel of morning coming with sharp teeth. At first light, they brought him out. The sky had gone pale iron over the eastern ridge. Frost silvered the tips of scrub in the low ground, gone almost as soon as the first light touched it. Horses stood saddled. Men moved with purpose, not haste. A party was forming. Takoda mounted without ceremony. Tawa was not among those riding, which eased something in Sealers he had not admitted needed easing. Nodin handed back his coat but not his revolver. "You ride unarmed," Nodin said. Thought that might be the case. A horse was brought for him. Good gelding, dark bay, not his own. He mounted stiffly, shoulder flaring hot. No one offered help, and he would not have taken it. They rode north and east through broken country that climbed steadily toward a shelf of pale stone overlooking a dry basin. The air sharpened higher up. Wind moved steady there, carrying far sound farther. Good ground for parley, or for witnesses, a place chosen by men who understood both. As they rode, Sealers saw sign of scouts on distant ridges. Takoda had not come trusting talk alone. By the time they reached the standing shelf, the sun had climbed high enough to turn the basin below into a wash of gold dust and dull thorn. The shelf itself was broad, flat, edged by a drop steep enough to discourage foolish horses. On the far side stood a single juniper twisted by years of wind into a permanent bend. No shelter, no softness, a place where truth had to stand without cover. They had not been the first to arrive. 3 riders waited already at the basin floor below. Deputy Mercer in his town coat, neat even from a distance. Elias Rusk on a sorrel with silver conchos too bright for honest work. And a third man in an agency hat, his posture bureaucratic and brittle, like he feared dust might stain authority if it got too close. More riders followed behind them, town men, 5, then 7, armed, nervous, the kind who sat straighter in a saddle when numbers made them brave. Takoda stopped on the shelf and looked down without expression. Sealers felt every pair of eyes shifting between him and the men below. He had the strange sensation of seeing the whole frontier narrowed into one ugly diagram. Badge, trader, chief, cowboy, each standing where somebody else had hoped they would. Mercer cupped his hands and called up, "Chief Takoda, we ride under peace." No one besides Sealers moved. Rusk called next, louder, voice carrying smooth as oiled rope. "We are here to settle a misunderstanding before worse comes of it." Sealers nearly smiled at that. Worse had already come. Men like Rusk just preferred arriving after the first damage and naming themselves solution. Takoda looked to Nodin. Nodin nodded once. Only then did Takoda ride down the slope toward the basin, his men following at measured intervals. Sealers was placed not beside Takoda and not among the rear guards either. In between, useful, dangerous, unclaimed. When they reached the basin floor, Mercer's gaze snapped to Sealers fast enough to reveal surprise before he could hide it. Well now, Sealers thought, there it is. Mercer recovered. "Creed, we heard you'd been taken." Rusk spread his hands from the saddle, smile thin and grieving. "Thank God you're alive. We feared the worst." Sealers said nothing. The agency man cleared his throat. "A serious incident has occurred involving federal interests and a missing minor. We are prepared to discuss return of all involved parties." Takoda's face stayed carved stone. "My son is not missing." That unsettled all 3 more than a shouted threat would have. Mercer shifted first, then bring him forward so all can see he's safe. Takoda did not even glance at him. "You do not summon my blood like livestock to market." Rusk leaned in, smile gone now. "Then we have a problem." Nodin answered before Takoda could. "No, you have one." The agency man looked at Sealers. "Mr. Creed, as a witness under territorial law, you are obliged to return and give statement." Sealers finally spoke. "About what?" The man blinked. "The abduction." Sealers let the word hang there. Mercer said quickly, "No one's accusing you, Creed, yet. We just need the facts straight before folks in town get worked up." Rusk added, "For everyone's sake." Sealers looked from one to the other. Mercer's collar was too tight. Rusk's glove leather was new. The agency man's boots carried dried mud from the North Ford, not the canyon trails. They had not been searching where Tawa was taken. They had been arranging where the story would land. He said, "Funny thing about facts. They limp worse every mile they travel with profit." Mercer's eyes hardened. "Careful," Takoda said quietly. "Let him speak." That silence around the basin changed then. Not much. Enough. Sealers told it plain. The boy in the gravel, the wound, the wrong arrow, the paper in the vest, the trade coats, the blue badge worn new not worked. He did not embroider, did not push, just laid each piece down like a nail on a table. When he finished, Mercer laughed once without humor. Convenient tale. The agency man said, "The document in question may be fabricated." Takoda reached inside his blanket and drew out the folded paper. Every eye in the basin locked on it. He did not hand it over. He only held it where all could see the seal. The agency man went pale under the dust. Rusk's face did something uglier than anger. It narrowed. Mercer said, "Chief, if that paper concerns agency business, withholding it could." Takoda cut him off, "Could expose who signed it." No answer. Takoda looked at Mercer, then at Rusk, then at the agency man. "My son was taken to bend my hand where treaties failed. This Cowboy interrupted that. Now you come not to search, but to gather whatever pieces remain useful." Rusk spat sideways. "You've got bold thoughts for a man standing between rifles." Takoda said, "Do I?" Sealers heard it then. Hooves, not close, all around the basin rim. Takoda's scouts had never left. The town men below heard it a beat later. Horses shifted. Hands tightened on reins. Reversal, not with bullets, with ground. Mercer's confidence cracked first. "Nobody wants blood here." "No," Takoda said. "But some came, wanting fear." He held up the paper once more. Then, in full view of town men, agency man, trader, deputy, and cowboy alike, he turned to Sealers. Nodin rode forward carrying something wrapped in dark cloth. Sealers felt the basin tighten. Nodin placed the wrapped object across his forearms. The weight told him before the cloth came away. A rifle, long-barreled, walnut dark with age and oil. Silver inlay worn soft along the stock, not showy, but careful. Near the butt was tied a narrow strip of old leather threaded with a single blue bead. Takoda's father's piece. The basin held its breath. Takoda's voice carried clear in the wind. "This was my father's rifle. He carried it when men in blue coats spoke peace and measured theft. I give it now to Sealers Creed, who lifted my son when wiser men would have stepped back." Shock moved through the town riders like a ripple through frightened cattle. Rusk's face went white with fury. Mercer looked as if the ground itself had misbehaved. The agency man stared not at Sealers, but at the rifle, as though old memory and present danger had just clasped hands in public. Takoda went on, not as payment, not as surrender, as witness. Sealers held the rifle and felt every consequence land at once. A gift from the opposing side did not soften the frontier, it redrew it, publicly, permanently. Takoda said, "Where this rifle stands, so stands my word. This man carried life, not theft." Mercer found his voice first. "Chief, you know what men in town will make of this?" Takoda answered, "Yes." Rusk leaned forward in the saddle, hatred stripped bare now. "Then he'll hang with it." Sealers looked at him. There it was. The real fear, not the paper alone, not the failed taking. This, a story turned wrong. A cowboy no longer simple to use. A public gift that made neutrality itself look like confession. Takoda saw it too. He looked to Silas, and in that glance the full shape of the burden Nodin had named passed between them. The rifle was honor, protection perhaps, but mostly burden. Because carrying it back north meant Silas would no longer be allowed the easy lie of being no part of this. Mercer pulled his horse half around, mind already racing ahead to town, to rumor, to control slipping. This isn't finished. Takoda said, no. Neither was Silas's life as it had been. He looked down at the rifle across his hands, at the blue bead tied to old leather, at the stock worn smooth by another man's years. Then he lifted his gaze to the ring of town riders, to Rusk's hate, to Mercer's calculation, to the agency man who suddenly wished he were anywhere else. The gift had done what bullets had not. It had chosen a side for him before he had spoken the next word. And when they turned their horses north again, the rifle lay across Silas Creed's saddle like a promise no town in that territory would forgive quietly. By the time Silas Creed rode back toward town, the rifle across his saddle had gathered more weight than walnut and steel could account for. Takoda's men peeled away one by one before the North Wash, leaving only Nodin beside him for the last stretch. They said little. Wind moved over the dry grass in long, pale waves. A hawk circled above a cutbank and vanished behind stone. It was the kind of late afternoon that made the country look empty until a man remembered how much could be hidden inside open ground. At the ridge before town, Nodin drew up his horse. "We go no farther," he said. Silas looked down toward the clustered roofs, the church steeple, the freight yard, the thin line of smoke rising from cook stoves and chimneys. Home, if the word still fit, probably for the best. Nodin's eyes went to the rifle. The best thing is seldom what men choose first. Silas almost answered, but Nodin reached out and touched the old leather strip threaded with the blue bead near the stock. Takoda's father carried this through 3 winters when the army counted his people by how much ground they could be pushed from. Men thought the rifle made him dangerous. It was not the rifle. It was the fact he had finally decided what he would not hand over. Nodin let his hand fall. "Now it asks that of you." Then he turned his horse and rode back south without waiting for reply. Silas sat another moment on the ridge, looking at the town that had known him as a quiet man with a small herd, a bad shoulder, and no appetite for trouble. Below him, sunlight struck the windows of the mercantile until they flashed like signals. He rode down. He was seen before he reached the first hitch rail. 2 boys hauling grain sacks stopped in the street and stared. A woman outside the dressmaker's turned, recognized him, then recognized the rifle, and drew her little girl back by the shoulder as if distance could keep rumor from touching them. Men outside the feed store fell quiet. One spat. Another looked away too fast. News had outrun him. Near the well, Sheriff Harlan Voss stepped from the shade with Deputy Mercer half a pace behind. Voss wore his usual dark coat, dust on the hem, hat pulled low enough to hide most of his thinking. He was a broad, worn man in late middle age, with a face that looked carved from something too practical for elegance. Mercer stood cleaner, stiffer, eager where Voss was measured. Voss's eyes settled first on Silas, then on the rifle. "You ride in carrying a storm," he said. "Looks that way." Mercer's jaw tightened. "You'd call it more than that if you had any sense." Silas kept his gaze on Voss. "You asking for my gun or for the story first?" Voss's mouth moved at one corner, not amusement, weariness meeting irony on familiar ground. "Both, eventually." Mercer stepped forward. "That rifle was given by a chief in open parley. Half the town saw it. It can be taken as a token of alliance against." "Against what?" Silas asked. "Bad bookkeeping." Mercer flushed. Voss cut in before the deputy could answer. "You can trade words later. Right now, tempers are up. Rusk's been talking, so has the agency man." "Of course he has." Voss tipped his head toward the sheriff's office. "Bring the rifle in till sunset. We'll hold a meeting after supper. Let folk hear it out before anyone grows brave with company." Silas looked at the office, then back down the street. Men were pretending not to watch from porches and doorways. They watched anyway. That was the trouble with towns. Privacy died first, then patience. He said, "No." Mercer gave a short laugh. "You don't get to say no." Silas finally looked at him. "I just did." Voss's voice stayed even. "You think walking around armed with that piece is going to calm anybody? It isn't a matter of calming them." "What is it then?" Silas's hand rested lightly on the worn stock. "It's witness." That word landed harder than a shout. Mercer heard it and went pale with anger. Voss looked at the rifle again, then back to Silas, and some private arithmetic moved behind his eyes. "Go home," he said. "Be at the meeting by sundown. Don't make me come fetch you between now and then." Mercer stared. "Sheriff." "Go home," Voss repeated to Silas. Silas nudged his horse forward. Mercer stepped as if to block him. Voss caught the deputy by the sleeve without looking. Silas rode on. At the edge of town, outside the cooper's yard, Elias Rusk leaned against a hitching post like a man waiting on a debt rather than a crisis. His sorrel stood behind him, saddled but resting. Rusk's vest was neat, boots polished, silver watch chain bright against his shirt front. He always looked like he expected the world to remain civilized so long as men like him kept profiting from it. "Creed," he called pleasantly, "got yourself noticed." Silas kept riding until Rusk stepped out far enough to make stopping kinder than trampling him. Rusk smiled as though they were meeting over coffee instead of kindling. "I hear you were in rough company." "I'm in it now." Rusk accepted that as if it were wit. "Maybe, but rough company changes depending where a man stands." His gaze slipped to the rifle. "Fine piece. Shame if folk misunderstood it." Silas said nothing. Rusk pushed away from the post. "I'm trying to help you here." Town S stirred up. Mercer's roar. The agency man's talking federal offense, the preacher's talking moral collapse, and every fool with a saddle thinks he's one rumor away from heroism. That's a bad mix. "Get to your point." "My point is simple. Bring that rifle to the meeting, set it on the table. Tell them the chief forced it on you to buy silence. Tell them you got clear as soon as you could. Men will mutter some, but they'll settle. I'll see to it." Silas looked at him for a long beat. "You'll see to it?" "Yes." "With what authority?" Rusk's smile thinned, then returned. "The authority of a man who knows where debts are paper and where fear is flesh." "There it was," Silas said. "You holding my note now?" Rusk didn't deny it. "Bank moved a stack of ranch papers last month. Times being what they are, I took an interest in local stability." "Bought cheap, did you?" "Bought available." He stepped closer. "You say the right thing tonight, and your place stays your place. Feed credit continues. Men forget faster than they claim. You say the wrong thing, and..." He let his eyes drift toward the road leading out to Silas's spread. "Country can get lonely when nobody'll trade." Silas felt the old bullet in his shoulder like a nail driven fresh. Rusk lowered his voice. "Whatever happened down south, don't be foolish enough to think truth matters more than consequence. It never has on a frontier, not unless somebody rich writes it down afterward." Silas looked at him long enough that the smile began to fray. Then he rode on without another word. His place lay a mile and a half beyond town, tucked where the land lifted into low stony ground and the wind struck cleaner. The house was small, the barn older than he was, or so the boards sometimes sounded in bad weather. A water trough, a lean-to shed, a stretch of wire fence patched in 3 places. No beauty to it except the kind built by endurance. He dismounted and carried the rifle inside. On the table lay a folded paper weighted by the salt jar. He opened it and read the short notice in a clerk's careful hand. The loan on his place had been transferred. Payment due in full within 10 days unless terms were reaffirmed by holder. Signed by Rusk's freight office. He set the paper back down and stared at it until the grain of the table blurred. The house smelled faintly of coffee grounds and dry wood. Quiet, no judgment in it. Just the same walls that had watched him come home alone through winters, through drought, through 2 bad seasons and 1 decent one. He thought of how easy a place could be lost, not in flood or fire, in signatures, in stories. In the moment a town decided a man no longer belonged inside its bargains. He hung his hat on the peg by the door and looked at the rifle across his palms. Give it up, and maybe the land stays. Lie, and maybe the town lets him grow old in peace. Tell the truth, and he keeps neither safety nor roof with any certainty. Once, long ago, he had done the sensible thing when the choice came dressed that way. He had followed an officer's order because the order protected his name and his enlistment and the shape of his life. By dawn, flames had chewed through a boarding house on the edge of a mining camp. He could still remember the stable boy's little boots outside in the mud where someone had lined them after. He had never found a way to put that memory down and keep respecting the man who walked away from it. By sundown, he rode back in. The meeting was held in the freight hall because it seated more men than the church and fewer than the saloon, which made folk feel virtuous even when they came wanting the same thing. Lamps burned along the walls. The air held dust, wool, lamp oil, and the close rank smell of a crowd trying to pretend it was there for order. Sheriff Voss stood near the front. Mercer on one side, Rusk on the other. Pastor Hume occupied a chair nearby with both hands folded on his hat like restraint itself had taken human shape. Storekeepers, drovers, farm wives, 2 railroad men, the blacksmith, 3 boys too young to be useful but old enough to be infected by other men's certainty. Most of the town had come. Conversation faltered as Sealers entered. He carried the rifle in plain sight. Mercer rose immediately. He was told. Voss silenced him with one look. Sit down. Sealers took a place near the wall, not hiding, not claiming the room either. Voss began with the kind of voice that had stopped more than one drunken fight before it ripened. We are here because rumors have outrun sense. We'll hear what there is to hear and then decide what peace requires. Peace requires strength, Mercer said. Peace requires shut mouths while I'm talking, Voss answered. A few men chuckled nervously. Mercer went still. Voss nodded to Sealers. Tell it. So Sealers did. He told of the canyon gravel under his boots, the blood on the boy's shirt, the broken arrow that wasn't tribal make, the agency paper folded in Tawa's vest, the false blue badge the boy described. He told of Takoda holding the paper, of Rusk and Mercer riding with the agency man to build a story before facts had a chance to stand up. He did not dress the truth for effect. He had learned that truth strained too hard often tore under its own performance. When he finished, the hall held a silence not of agreement but of collision. Men trying to fit what they wanted into what they had heard. Then Rusk stood. He did it slowly, as if he hated being forced into public unpleasantness, but would endure it for the common good. He had the sort of face that wore righteousness well enough to fool tired people. This is a fever tale, he said. One man rides into hostile ground, comes back bearing an enemy chief's rifle, and expects decent folk to believe he stumbled over federal conspiracy like a rock in the road. He spread one hand. I grieve for the boy, truly. But if there's a question between the agency and the tribe, it ought to be settled by law, not by a cowboy gone sentimental. Sentimental, that stirred more trouble than an insult might have. Frontier towns forgave anger sooner than softness. Mercer took hold of the moment. The chief armed him in open defiance. That much is fact. We can argue over paper and wounds later. Right now, the question is whether this town allows itself to be made a fool. Pastor Hume cleared his throat. It is also a question of influence. Gifts carry obligation. Scripture. Scripture didn't carry that boy out of a canyon, Sealers said. The pastor went red at once. Not from the words alone, from being interrupted by a man who usually left sermons undefeated through silence. Voss looked tired enough to age 3 years in one breath. Rusk, Mercer, answer this plain. Why were you already riding south with an agency man before the town even knew the boy was safe? Mercer said, we were acting on concern. Rusk added, any responsible men would. Silas spoke before Voss could. Then why was your concern aimed at the village and not the canyon spring where he was taken? A murmur moved through the room. Rusk smiled without warmth, because unlike some, I don't chase dust trails on hunches. No, Silas said, you arrange where they end. That did it. Rusk's pleasant face cracked open just enough to show the machinery beneath. You'd better think hard before turning your own people into villains to spare the feelings of those south of the Wash. My own people, Silas repeated. The room heard that too. Voss stepped between the lines before they hardened further. Enough. This town is not riding anywhere tonight. Mercer turned on him. You can't mean that. I can and do. You'll let them sit armed while we wait on paperwork. I'll let men keep breathing till I know whose lie I'm about to kill them for. That shut Mercer for a beat. Rusk used the beat. Then perhaps we speak of nearer matters. His gaze slid to Silas. Since Mr. Creed wants truth in daylight, daylight can show him some too. His loan on the Creed place is due 10 days by notice. However, he paused with theatrical reluctance. As holder of that paper, I can extend grace. If he places that rifle in Sheriff Voss's keeping and states for the record that the gift was made under pressure, not alliance. A wave passed through the room, some shocked, some relieved. Here at last was a tidy door out. Voss stared at Rusk. You set this up now. Rusk lifted one shoulder. I'm solving a problem. No, Silas said quietly. You're pricing one. All at once the hardest part of the choice stood naked where everybody could see it. Not just truth or lie, roof or none, feed or none, trade or none, a place in this town or the long, cold shoulder that followed a man farther than weather. Voss looked at Silas, and for the first time that evening, there was something almost like warning in his eyes. Not official warning. Human, take the way out. Don't be noble enough to starve. Mercer sensed it too and pressed. Set the rifle down, Creed. Say what needs saying, and folks move on. Silas looked around the hall, at the faces, some afraid, some eager, some embarrassed by their own willingness to be bought if the price sounded enough like peace. He saw Mrs. Vale from the boarding house, keeping one hand on her grown daughter's arm, as though old fires never quite ended for women who had once run through them. He saw the blacksmith looking at the floor, because iron men dislike crooked work when it wears law's boots. He saw boys learning in one night how cheaply adults could rent out courage. He looked finally at the rifle in his hands. Takoda's father had carried it when men measured theft while smiling. Now it asked what would not be handed over. Silas stepped forward and laid the rifle across the front table with a carefulness that made half the room think he had yielded. Then he put his palm flat on the stock. I won't surrender it, he said. The room broke in noise, shock, anger, one curse thrown sharp, a woman gasping, Mercer half rising. Voss barking for quiet and not getting it fast enough. Silas's voice came harder now, not louder, just cut cleaner. This rifle isn't a bribe, it's a witness, same as me. You want peace built on a lie because lies are cheaper than decency when a town's scared. I know, I've helped do it before. The last line cost him more than the rest. Not again. Mercer slammed his hand on the chair back. Then you set yourself against this town. No, Silas said. I set myself against the men trying to use it. Rusk's face went flat. Then hear mine plain. Feed credit ends tonight. Your note stands. No extension. Any merchant trading to your place does so without my freight line. Let's see how principal winters. The old phrase came back to Silas from the canyon. The best truth I can offer. So he offered one of his own. Then I'll winter honest. He lifted the rifle back into his hands and turned toward the door. No one stopped him. That was worse. When towns decide not to lay hands on a man, often it means they mean to let hunger and distance do the work instead. He rode home under a sky gone black, blue, and cold. The first thing he smelled was smoke. Not cookfire smoke, not cedar, hay and old timber taking flame. He kicked his horse hard and came over the last rise to see the hay barn burning from the west side, fire climbing the boards in hungry orange ladders while sparks spun up into the dark. For one cracked second, he thought of giving chase to whoever had done it. Then one of the horses screamed from inside the side pen. He was off the saddle before his horse fully stopped. He threw the rifle clear of the sparks, grabbed an axe from the chopping block, and hacked at the pen gate while heat rolled over him. The latch gave. One mare burst out wild-eyed and nearly knocked him flat. The gelding balked. He hauled on the halter, shoulder tearing, lungs filling with cinder and old smoke at once. No neighbors came. He got the gelding loose. He dragged 2 saddles clear. He watched the roof go. By the time the flames settled into a red ruin, the barn was half collapsed, and the trough water steamed uselessly nearby. Sealers stood in the ash-black yard, shirt stuck to him with sweat and soot, one hand on the trembling neck of the mare he had saved. The rifle lay where he had flung it, untouched by fire, the blue bead catching the red glow like a cold eye. No one had come, not because they had not seen, because they had. And as the last beam folded inward and the sparks rose into the dark above his place, Sealers understood that keeping the rifle had already taken its first payment, and dawn would only come to collect more. He was still awake when daylight found the ashes. The west half of the yard smelled of wet soot, scorched hay, and that sour bitter scent old fires leave behind in wood that meant something before it became a lesson. Frost clung in the shadow of the house, turning black mud grey-white around the burned posts. The mare stood with her head low by the fence. The gelding had not settled enough to eat. Sealers moved slow because his body had shortened itself around pain during the night. Shoulder stiff, lungs raw from smoke, hands blistered where the axe handle had rubbed through skin. He carried one half-burned board out of the ruin and dropped it in a pile beside the shed, then another. By the 6th his arm began to shake. By the 8th he stopped pretending it would not. No one rode up from town, not with water, not with sympathy, not even with curiosity honest enough to wear a face. He went inside, drank coffee black and bitter, then stepped back onto the porch with the cup in one hand and the rifle in the other. He had cleaned soot from the stock before dawn. A ridiculous act, maybe, but a man tends what he has decided to keep. From the road came hoofbeats at last. He set the cup down and watched Sheriff Voss ride in alone. The sheriff dismounted without hurry and stood a moment taking in the ruin. He was not the kind of man to whistle at damage, not the kind to say, "That's a shame," when he had no intention of helping. For that alone, Sealers had always respected him. "Rusk?" Voss asked. Sealers shrugged once, didn't leave a calling card. Voss looked at the blackened boards, then at the untouched house, then at the lane. Professional enough to know where fear lands best. Sealers said nothing. Voss tipped his hat back. The lines around his eyes looked carved deeper this morning. "I came to tell you Mercer resigned his badge at dawn and rode out before breakfast." That surprised Sealers more than it should have. Running. Maybe headed to hide behind another office door. Voss's mouth set hard. The agency man gone too. Rusk. Still in town. Men like him don't run till they've moved the ledger first. Wind stirred ash along the yard. Voss watched it travel. "I can't prove he burned you out," the sheriff said. "Can't prove he didn't, but I can tell you this, folk are talking different now, not better, different. A man doesn't resign a badge at sunrise unless the night before left too much truth under his boots." Sealers looked toward town. "Different won't roof the horses." "No." Voss reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small canvas sack. Nails, not many, enough to matter. He set it on the porch rail as casually as a man might leave tobacco. "I bought extra," he said. Sealers glanced at him. Voss's face dared him to comment on charity, so Sealers only nodded once. "Much obliged." The sheriff looked at the rifle leaning by the door. "You still keeping it?" "Yes." Voss breathed out through his nose. "Then keep it all the way. Half a stand is worse than none." He mounted, gathered his reins, then paused. "Pastor Hume will preach on betrayal this Sunday. Mrs. Vale told her boarders she'll still sell you eggs if you come after dusk. The blacksmith says he's too busy to shoe your mare, but sent word his nephew might be wandering idle near your place tomorrow. That's what different looks like around here." He turned the horse toward the road. "Not much," Sealers said. "No," Voss answered, "but it's more than yesterday." After he rode off, the yard went quiet again. Sealers spent the morning pulling salvage from the ruin. Hinges, a pitchfork head, 2 lengths of chain. By noon the sun had warmed the ash enough to release deeper smoke. Sweat strung his eyes. Once he had to brace himself against the trough because the shoulder gave a mean little bolt that grayed the edges of his sight. He heard the wagon before he saw it, not from town, from the south road. He straightened slowly and looked up. A mule wagon came over the rise carrying cedar poles, canvas rolls, and 2 sacks that looked heavy with grain. Nodden drove. Beside him sat Tawa, blanket around his shoulders, but upright, alert, his face still thin from the wound, yet no longer gray with fever. 2 other men rode behind. No war paint, no display. Work faces, quiet hands. Sealers stood still as they came into the yard. Nodden climbed down first. Tawa followed more carefully, one hand at his side for a moment before he let go. He had grown paler in the healing, but his eyes were sharper now. Children who brush close to death often look as if they have heard adults lie in a new language. Nodden surveyed the ruin without wasting time on reaction. "You have no barn." "That's the shape of it. So we brought wood." He said it like weather, simple, sufficient. Sealers looked at the wagon, then at Tawa. "You shouldn't be riding yet." Tawa frowned at that. "You shouldn't be lifting boards." "Fair enough," Sealers said. "Did Takoda send you?" Nodden untied the first load strap. "Takoda said a rifle is not enough if a burden has to stand in the rain." That sat in the yard between them with more weight than any formal speech could have managed. Sealers glanced toward town, half expecting riders, outrage, witnesses hungry for offense. What he saw instead was distance. A couple of far shapes on the road, maybe watching, maybe only passing. Word would spread soon enough. "You know what folk will call this," he said. Nodden lifted a cedar pole down from the wagon. "Yes." "And you came anyway?" Nodden's eyes met his. "Yes." Tawa, already at the grain sack, said, "The mare needs feeding more than names." Sealers looked at him, and despite everything, a brief worn smile pulled at one side of his mouth. "You sound like your father." Tawa answered with complete seriousness. "That is usually what people tell me when I'm right." Work began, not fast, not graceful, but work has its own language, and by mid-afternoon the yard was speaking it. Cedar posts laid out, charred debris pulled aside, canvas stretched for temporary cover. Tawa sorted nails into tins with solemn concentration, stopping only when the woman from the village who had tended him rode, in carrying a bundle of herbs and a tighter bandage for Sealers' shoulder than he would ever have put on himself. She did not ask permission. She simply took his arm, frowned at the swelling, and said, "You keep healing like a mule thinks." He almost told her he had never heard a truer diagnosis, but the set of her mouth suggested humor was not being entertained in that moment. By late afternoon, another rider came from town. Then another. The first was the blacksmith's nephew, exactly as Voss had predicted, a lanky boy with freckles and an expression that tried for carelessness and landed near purpose. He carried horseshoes and said, without looking directly at Nodden or Tawa, "Uncle had extra iron." The second was Mrs. Vale's eldest son, with a basket of bread his mother had supposedly baked too much of, though no one in town believed in accidental excess from a boarding house kitchen. Neither stayed long, neither said anything generous. Both left after doing what they had come to do, as if the frontier had taught them that decency was safest when disguised as inconvenience. It was enough. Toward evening, Sheriff Voss rode by again and did not stop. He only tipped 2 fingers from the reins to Sealers, then to Nodden, and kept going. That too was enough. Rusk never came, but his freight wagons did not pass south that week, nor the next. Talk went around town that papers were being looked into at the territorial office. That Mercer's resignation had not kept a marshal from wanting him found. That the agency man had vanished all the way to Santa Fe or nowhere at all, depending which liar held the floor. Rusk shut himself inside his office for 2 days and emerged meaner and less certain, which in men like him is the nearest thing to public defeat. Sealers did not chase any of it, he worked. The burned barn became first a frame, then a skeleton with intention, then a structure again, not the same one. Fire makes sure of that, but sound enough to roof hay and hold winter off if the season was kind or at least evenly cruel. Tawa came twice more, then 4 times, sometimes with Nodden. Once with Takoda himself, who said almost nothing, set 2 cedar planks in place with his own scarred hands, then stood a long while by the rebuilt side wall looking across the land, as if measuring not acreage but consequences. When he finally spoke, it was to Sealers alone. Men in town still hate what this means. Yes, some of mine do too. Sealers leaned on the post he had just set. Seems fair. Takoda's clouded eye gave nothing. The clear one rested on the rifle hanging just inside the open house door, above the table where Sealers kept his coffee tin and papers. You kept it dry, Takoda said. I was told to keep it all the way. A thin, almost smile touched the chief's mouth and was gone. Then do that. He left before supper. Weeks moved, not into peace exactly. Peace is too proud a word for what frontiers manage, but into something less eager for blood. Freight no longer crossed south without being counted from both sides. Sheriff Voss met twice with Takoda at the Standing Shelf and once by the spring where Tawa had been taken. No one called those meetings friendship. That helped them happen. Rusk lost 2 contracts and most of his smile. The banknote on Sealers's place changed hands again, this time to a lawyer in the county seat who preferred money slow and legal to fast and flammable. The terms became bearable, not kind, bearable. On Sundays, Pastor Hume still preached around the edges of contamination and compromise. Yet after service, more than one man who had shouted loudest in the freight hall found reasons to speak quieter when passing Sealers on the road. Not apologies. Frontiers rarely afford those in full, but a kind of shame that knew its own outline. By first frost, a strange habit had settled over the land. At the North Well, women from town began finding baskets of chokecherries left at dawn when harvest ran thin. No one claimed them. At the South Wash, one of Takoda's herders found a broken wagon wheel repaired overnight with smithwork no village forge had done. No one claimed that either. Reciprocity has a way of teaching before it names itself. On a blue-cold evening in late autumn, Sealers finished hanging the new barn door and stepped back to test the swing. It moved clean. No drag. No complaint from the hinges. Good work, shared work, even if half the hands involved would not admit in town whose nails had held what. He heard a horse and turned. Tawa sat on a small dun mare at the gate, a little straighter than he had a month ago, wrapped in a winter coat too big through the shoulders because children recover in leaps that shame prediction. Across the saddle in front of him lay a sapling no thicker than a broom handle, its roots wrapped in damp cloth. Sealers walked over. What's that for? Tawa looked toward the patch of ground beside the barn where the fire had scorched deepest. A cottonwood, he said. My father says they remember water even when the ground looks wrong. Sealers took the sapling carefully, and you figured this place needed remembering. Tawa considered him with the grave impatience of boys who have already survived enough to dislike obvious questions. It needs growing. They planted it by the west wall where the old barn had fallen hottest. The dirt was stubborn from the first skim of cold, but not impossible. Tawa knelt to pat it firm around the roots. Sealers fetched a bucket. The mare cropped dead grass nearby and puffed steam into the evening. From far off came the faintest sound of a wagon on the road to town, then another beyond that heading south. Different, still different. When the little tree stood on its own, Tawa rose and brushed his palms clean. Sealers looked at it, bare stem, small thing, easy to miss if a man only counted what was loud. You think it'll take? He asked. Tawa shrugged. If no one burns it. Sealers let out a breath that might have been a laugh. The boy glanced at the rifle visible through the open house door. You still keep it there? Yes. My father says men will know where you stand when they see it. Maybe. Tawa looked up at him. Do you? Sealers turned toward the fading light over the ridge, toward town roofs catching the last cold red of day, toward the south where smoke from Takoda's winter fires would be rising straight in the still air. He thought of the canyon gravel, of the lie he had refused, of the barn that burned, of nails left on a porch by a sheriff too tired for speeches, of cedar poles unloaded by men who had every reason not to care and chose otherwise. Of how a frontier changes, not by forgetting what happened, but by being forced to live beside it honestly. Yes, he said at last, I think I do. Tawa nodded as if that answer met some private standard, then mounted again and turned the dun mare toward the south road. Halfway to the gate, he looked back. You were right, he said. About what? That it was worth it. Then he rode off into the early dark. Sealers stood by the young cottonwood until the hoofbeats faded. The wind had dropped. The new barn cast a longer, steadier shadow than the old one ever had. Inside the house, the rifle hung above the table, old leather strip and blue bead resting still against the stock. Not payment, not peace, not even forgiveness. Witness. He picked up the empty bucket, went inside, and left the door open to the cooling evening, while the land, altered in small hard-won ways, settled around him.